going. We're in.
Okay. Hello,
Yeah.
everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today, Wednesday here in Napa, and I guess all over the world for that matter, Wednesday everywhere for our study hall. And we have a special guest today. Monica Vescovi is going to be interviewing someone very special to talk a little bit about what is going on in Napa and California in general concerning the wildfires and some of the challenges that are presented during this vintage and this harvest. So let me go ahead and bring our guests.
Welcome. Welcome. I'm so thrilled to have you here with us, Julie. Julie Lumgeyer, who's a luxury tier winemaker here in Napa and Sonoma, working with one of the famous producers here, Jay Moss, but a consulting winemaker with many others. But also, she's on a committee of the Unified Wines and Grapes Symposium, advisory board of the Innovation and Quality, and she's a chair of Napa and Sonoma Winemaking and Viticultural Roundtable of Women for the Wine Sense. So amazing winemaker, and we picked an topic for our discussion today that is a huge challenge for all the winemakers through California, but through Napa, Sonoma, Central Valley particularly. We're going to talk about challenges of 2020. And if you can see the window behind me, I'm here in Napa. The sky is orange. We are in the midst of the ash right now. And so let's jump in and talk about how that and many other challenges of 2020 are going to affect the vintage. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate Napa Valley Wine Academy and you hosting me today for this discussion. As a longtime winemaker for 15 vintages plus in Sonoma County and Napa Valley, as well as Italy, I feel like we've seen a lot, and this is definitely an unprecedented harvest. I'm very happy to be a resource to all of the different students and study groups, and I look forward to this conversation.
Okay, great. So let's start with the very beginning of the cycle. We were discussing what were the challenges that influence how the 2020 vintage is going to be like. And in our previous conversation, you mentioned that we don't need to look only at the beginning of this cycle. We have to go back to the fires that were there before, even to Kincaid fire. So where is the beginning of what we feel today?
Well, putting the vintage 2020 in a frame, I guess let's start with two frameworks. As a grape grower and as a winemaker, we have to come at what is the goal for the winemaking and where are we making it? Because as we all know, great wines are made in the vineyard. When you and I spoke, the focus you wanted to talk about today was primarily the North Coast luxury tier and ultra premium wine market, Sonoma, Napa Valley. Even within that agricultural landscape, you're talking, well over 1 million acres of land, and a very small amount of cultivation of high-end wine grapes are nested all over, those acreages. So, for example, of all the grapes in California, Napa Valley's grapes would be 4% of the wine made in an average vintage. So we're going to definitely focus in on a piece of a piece, but it's the, kind of the preeminent world wine capital mentality and what we're struggling with in this vintage and how we will overcome it. When I look at how this started in the vineyards, in parts of northern Sonoma, we had what was called the Kincaid fire during late October of last year. And that impacted the thinking for mainly Cabernet, Bordeaux varietals, certain key whites coming into this year if those vineyards had been affected by fire. And then the rest of the AVA, thankfully, was not touched by fires in vintage 2019. The life cycle of the vine, which informs our winemaking, is about the starting cycle of pruning, usually through bud break, flowering, fruit set, veraison, and then the harvest decisions. However, when you had fire in a vineyard, you have to add a few steps on because you have to assess the damage. So just realize that the people who were impacted by the Kincaid fire did have to do a lot more work during the winter season, and that added to the further challenges of 2020 for a couple of key AVAs and the Sonoma overall envelope.
So which challenges would you say they had to go through? What are the things that they had to do after the Kincaid fire in order to prepare for the next vintage?
What we've learned from fires all over the world that have been studied, everywhere from Australia to British Columbia, as well as the United States, is that when a vineyard burns through, in large part, grapevines are highly resistant to fire, and they are a fantastic fire break, which has benefited many people's homes and other key infrastructure. However, if a fire really does get super hot and go through a vineyard, it can damage the vines, and the vines will slowly tell you about the damage beyond the obvious catastrophic level. You have to watch the grapes in the coming two vintages to see if the sap flow is actually correct and if the vineyard will come back and produce in the same way. So in vintage 2020, for any vineyards that did get burned through, because the Kincaid fire was fairly substantial, there's a lot of extra experimentation and work and observation going on. But for the greater part of our conversation today, I think, it's good for us to go ahead and start knowing that some people are doing an extra set of work, and then let's move forward.
Okay, so we're going to the next step. We're in the winter. This winter particularly did not bring a lot of rain. That's another issue that you can feel in the vineyards and that you can have to address in your vineyard management, right? So what happens here?
Well, with a very dry winter, which is what we experienced, you're going to have less penetration to the overall roots of all the vineyards. You're not going to have what's called a full root flush, and that's a blessing and a curse. Obviously, it's a blessing to the winemaker if it produces a smaller crop, higher concentration, smaller berry size. All of those things get us very excited because you're going to have less of what you want, but you're going to have great quality and concentration in the vintage. Of course, if you're a grower, it is going to come up short on tons, and that can be rather disappointing for obvious reasons economically.
So roughly this year, how much shorter is the vintage in that luxury tier, in the luxury vintage management? How much shorter is the production?
On average, and it depends on the varietal again, because different vineyards are going to be planted in different places that are suffering from different water deficits or not. But on average, the crop was being estimated 30% short.
30%. Okay.
Yeah. So it reminds me a lot of 14 and 15 when California was in the third and fourth years of the last big drought cycle. And I will note we've made outstanding wines from those vintages. So again, it can be a winemaker blessing, but it is a bit of a burden on our grape growing friends.
Okay, so we know that's another challenge, and then let's go to even those challenges that are pre-smoke taint, which we're going to discuss in just a moment. The workers shortages. We are on top of everything. We are in state of pandemic. The vineyard management, the procedures in the winery had to change tremendously, and on top of that, there are not enough employees. What are the challenges here?
Yeah, you've summed that up very well. Going into vintage 2020, we have two different industries that occupy the space in the Sonoma County and the Napa Valley industry. There are the large-scale producers, and then there are the more artisan-scale or smaller producers. Large-scale, in excess of 100,000, usually over 1 million cases produced. And then you get into the artisan scale, it can be defined as less than 10,000, 5,000, or 1,000 cases. Out of 10,000 wineries in the U.S., a large majority of them are in California. And in our AVAs alone, it's the 80-20 rule or more. So there's lots of small producers who are impacted differently on worker shortages versus larger operations. Going into the year in the vineyards, we were very much short on hand labor, mechanical options have been explored and implemented by many people for the economics as well as overcoming the labor shortage. However, none of us saw what was coming around the corner, which was COVID-19, and that further exacerbated our labor funnel issues, because now you have to do the same amount of work in the same amount of time, and yet you have to do it at a distance with adding in lots of other sanitation and worker protections. So it was hard enough to find enough people to do the job we needed to do. Obviously, wages were rising to meet and address some of that. And then the pandemic hit. As we all know, that had an economic as well as a health and safety implication for our workforce. And all of a sudden, everybody's quarantined at home except for essential workers. Now, on a positive note, for our industry, both grape growing and all agricultural operations, as well as production, were considered essential. So we were not banned from going to work, unlike the hospitality or the restaurant side of the industry. So we remain working at full speed, but at a distance and with a few extra steps every time we go in the cellar or go in the field.
Okay, so there's a lot of diversity there, and let's move on to the biggest challenge right now, the smoke taint. So as everybody can see behind the windows right now, the air is extremely polluted, even here in Napa City. And in vineyards, there's the smoke taint, and it's been there in some of the vineyards, not all of them, and some of the vineyards for quite some time now. How can that damage the grapes? What is the exposure? How long can the exposure be? And another thing, how will that affect wine, and what has to happen? Because I know right now the grape growers and winemakers are really worried about the quality of the grapes. There are labs that are working furiously right now, checking the quality of the grapes in order to make sure that those wines that will be coming in luxury tiered will be the great wines.
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and start with the last point. Absolutely. In Napa Valley and in all the AVAs of Sonoma County, the winemaking and vineyard teams are absolutely dedicated to upholding our hard-fought and long-earned reputation for making the best wines in the United States and some of the best wines in the world. So we all know that this is a classic example of having to play long ball, and you do not do anything that's a short-term conversation, that could cost you your long-term place in the market or the trust of your customers. So with that in mind, we remain committed to making the world's finest quality wines, and it means that not everything is going to get made this year if, in fact, scientifically, there are problems. So it's going to be a shorter than average crop with a shorter than average production capacity behind it. And everything that you expect from quality standards in both Napa Valley and Sonoma County is going to be there in the final product. There will simply be less of it. Now, bridging to your two key points, which is, let's talk about what is smoke taint, how long has this been going on, and then your second point, more of the technical information of the impact. How deep do you want to go?
Okay, so let's start with what is a smoke taint, and let's explain fully how does the smoke taint influence the wine. So what happens when there is a smoke taint in the grapes?
Okay, starting with what is the definition of smoke taint, something that all of us can relate to is there's this character of smoky burnt, like campfire, wet ashes, like a retro nasal feeling. And just so you know, there's a blessed approximately 25% of people just can't even smell this. So this is a non-issue for them. However, everybody else has varying degrees of sensitivity, or what is certain properties in the bound matrix of the wine differently. So we're already getting deep into the science lesson. The relationship between fires and potential smoke taint all involves thermal degradation of lignin, which creates volatile phenols. So when things burn, if they have lignins, there are these hundreds of compounds that are created that are volatile phenols. There are approximately 7 plus that are being studied globally right now, and a lot of work is being done. And ever since 2015, 17, 18, and now, there are collaborations going on literally globally and with our key labs. How the volatile phenols, which have markers that are tested in the laboratory, affect the grape is that the smoke is carrying into the skins of the grapes. Doesn't matter if they're white or red. And it gets into the flesh of the grape. And obviously for winemaking, we're trying to extract gorgeous things from the skins of the grapes. So there's an obvious issue that there's something new that's been put inside that will get in the way. The vines are susceptible to smoke taint in very different ways. Certain varietals are more susceptible. For example,
and white and red, right? Because let's also take a look at the winemaking, because the smoke taint affects the skin of the berry. Well, white wines generally less affected than the red wines.
It goes back to what can be expressed and when the smoke happens. The grapes are most susceptible, whether they're white or red, from the time that veraison occurs and they're changing from the hard green berries into the soft, ripe structure of either a white grape or a red wine grape. And there's a diagram, which is frequently used by Dr. Anita Oberholzer from UC Davis, that talks about, imagine an iceberg where you can see that much sticking out of the water and there's so much more below it. That's kind of imagine how volatile phenols and non-volatile phenols, but these compounds, which we're calling VP for short, work in the process of going from the grape into the winemaking. And it takes making wine from these grapes to release the larger portion of bound up VPs that are the ice that's underneath the ocean, if you know what I mean. So you can tell some of what's being smoke tainted right off the bat, but not everything. So the key is there's bound and there's free volatile phenols. There is testing, and you asked me in our pre-conference about the timeline for pre-testing. Right now, if I sent a sample to the lab, if it was grapes, which are not fermented and straight out of the field, it would take me till October 19th today to get my results for 2 markers. And at the winery, it will take me, I believe October 7th. So we're having to invent new ways to learn about this, and we're doing a lot of pre-fermentation, mini fermentation, and doing a very strong technical process to understand and lot grade these things while you're putting it into the lab, but you're going to get that information a lot later.
Okay, so once you get that later, what's going to happen to the grapes, calling in the grapes from the grape grower to the production? Would that mean that some of the wines will have overripe fruit in this vintage?
It depends on, again, where the vineyard has been. We have also, right after the smoke, there was a complicating factor of record heat wave. So yes, we're in a position right now where the economics of the industry would dictate to get the better wine, you need to go ahead and call a pick out of the vineyard, bring the grapes in at optimal ripeness, and produce them, regardless of their potential for smoke taint or not. Obviously, there's an economic issue there because that's a lot of work and a lot of capital to put into something that hasn't gotten tested yet. So all the wineries that are electing to optimize their pick dates without the benefit of our lab science coming back for the smoke markers or the VPs, we're taking a risk, and we're taking a calculated risk. That risk has been calculated by walking the vineyard, looking for physical observations such as ash, looking at wind direction, looking at the fresher the smoke, the greater the risk sometimes, and the density of the smoke isn't really the issue because volatile phenols are not what you see. Smoke is different from volatile phenols. Volatile phenols are actually rather invisible particle size. So, we're taking a risk. The grape grower growers, conversely, can also file for crop insurance that they are prohibited from picking the grapes if they have crop insurance and file
because
for
I
it.
know there, on the other hand, now grape growers are often facing changes in their contracts. They are asked to do the tests on the grapes, and many of the buyers presented with the grape growers with amendments into the contract, breaking down the percentages of a payment when those volatile phenols are going to show up in the lab or in the fermentation, right? So that's a hard decision for the grape grower as well, because they have to make a decision: are we going to sell, or are we going to claim the insurance?
And that has definitely been addressed by one of our key trade organizations, California Association of Wine Grape Growers, COG, has not only been working extensively on worker safety since the COVID issues started in the spring, and going through to smoke issues, but also to the economic issues, and really encouraging our winery partners to do the right thing and to keep that open communication and a win-win spirit of collaboration with the grape growers, because this is not a game of hot potato where one person should be left holding the bag and incur economic misery while someone else gets off scot-free. There were some industry examples in other states and this one in prior vintages where large debates did occur on that. And I hope a lot of our trade associations, whether it's grape growers or vintners in either county, we are fostering open communication and a lot of forums and collaboration. Again, it comes down to the individual actions of who is the person whose handshake is on that contract, and are they going to try to be collaborative and win-win, or are they going to, basically look out for themselves first and their neighbors second? And obviously you can see where I'm coming from. As a fifth-generation farmer and a first-generation winemaker, this whole system does not work sustainably in perpetuity if we don't help each other out. That being the case, there are a lot of grape growers who are now doing mini bucket ferments. People's bathtubs are overflowing with small home wineries now, trying to get ahead of the issues and see what their winemakers may see when they're doing their own ferments. And there's a lot of extra effort going on right now. You still have to get the lab results to make sure you can document the mini ferment or a grape sample with crop insurance. For your people in your group, something to know is the results at the laboratory are different if you are working on a sweet juice from a grape sample, or if you're working on a dry or nearly dry wine from a mini fermentation sample. And in fact, the volatile phenol markers, because they are released using the interaction of volatile phenols and sugars and these glycoside pathways that happen in ferments, the bottom line is you get a lot more information from checking a wine that is virtually dry. And the levels of markers can present at 2 to nearly 6 times higher in a dry wine, which is exactly why we wish right now we had more lab capacity. You get better information and you can make better decisions for better wine.
And this is crucial now, and I'm sure that 2020 is going to bring more labs, and that will be one of the improvements that will be made next year. So we are for whites, we are almost past the harvest time in the area, but we are still ahead of the harvest for the reds at the moment, right? We're still right before that. So few things with the with the situation being and the way it is. It's not only an issue of late picking, but it's also an issue of safety of the employees, which is like very hard thing at the moment, because the ash in the air is very potent right now. So that's another huge challenge to be called for the production of the 2020 vintage. So let's look ahead. I would like you to actually tell me. We'll talk about yesterday, which is very important information for everybody who loves Napa and Sonoma wines, because there are challenges in this vintage. We all know it, but we also know how hard winemakers and vineyard owners are working right now to bring 2020 into high quality, because the smoke taint and other challenges, they don't mean that 2020 will be a difficult vintage when it comes to the glass. It means that all of you heroes are making this, well, you're working so much harder to make the best out of it. So what are the steps that you're going to be taking now in order to make sure that you will be giving to your customers that beautiful wines that you have been for many vintages, taking the risks on one hand, and on the other, of course, there's a lot of business decisions that you're going to take. But what are the possible steps at the moment?
Thank you so much for recognizing that, as they say, this is an unprecedented vintage. And have you ever watched the Kentucky Derby when they run it on like a nightmare rain year? And it's a slog, but it's still the Kentucky Derby. It's still the great race, and the run for the roses never stops. And yeah, we're going to have to run a little harder in the rain this year, so to speak, if we were having that metaphor. But it doesn't mean that we aren't going to run a phenomenal race. It means we are going to be working extra hard. And again, let's just cut to the question that looms in people's minds who aren't on the floor with me in the cellar or in the field with the workers every day. Where's all that stuff going to go that isn't going to make the grade? And the answer is it's either going to go, laying on the vineyard floor, never get picked, or if we took it to tank and it fails, there are certain programs in the wine industry where you can dispose of wine that, for whatever sensory reason, is not up to your quality standard. And I'll say I venture a lot of your viewers and students are probably not doing large-scale box wine and certain things, but there in every industry there are ways to get rid of things that are not up to your quality standards. For wine of Napa and Sonoma caliber, wines of reputation, nothing that is tainted is going to be bottled. The economics would be foolish. The reputation risk would be insane. So just like other vintages where there have been problems, it simply means we will be making less wine. But the wine that we do choose to make, and I'll explain those steps in a moment, are going to be of the exact reputation and caliber that you expect from all of us for Napa or Sonoma wine of that top quality level. So what are some of the steps that we're taking?
Okay.
First, in the vineyard, of course, we've mentioned a lot about these mini ferments. Of course, we check grapes and we walk vineyards, miles of boot prints every vintage. But I promise you, we're probably putting on 10 times as many miles in the field this year and doing so much more sampling and so much more work in the lab on our own bench labs, because we have to try to get ahead of this. Mitigation in the winery. When you bring it in, let's just use a red grape example. Say I'm going to be making Cabernet. I'm going to be picking it that much more carefully. We're going to be making really sure that we don't get any mold material other than grapes. For example, little bits of stems, berries, leaves into the cart. Hand picking is essential this year because the risk with mechanical, once you've had a smoke incident like this, it will increase the ability to extract volatile phenols. So on the very high end, of course, we're going to be working slowly, carefully, hand picking, bring it in, sorting extra hard at the crush pad. And then as we go into the fermenters, and using the red grape example, volatile phenols, unfortunately, just like a lot of other really attractive things that are inside the wine grape matrix, are largely extracted within 5 days. So the best advice technically that we can do, and we've all learned this from other fire incidences in the past, is to not try to skip out and, barely squeeze the grapes or, ferment them in a super short window of time, because it's counterproductive to the quality of winemaking. You still make your best wine with your best protocol. But when I take that red fermentation into the press, I'm going to be running a lot more time and expense in press cuts. Free run number 1, free run number 2. not pressing narrowly to the level that you might in a standard vintage, and keeping everything completely separate. On top of that, once you have oak in the equation, you are going to mask some of these markers because, of course, toasted oak barrels are wood lignans, and that can interfere with your ability to read for some of these other compounds that we will be watching to emerge.
So would you be using barrels that have higher level toasting for the vintage? Would that be one of the solutions?
We usually order our barrels long before we see the grapes hit the crush pad. So again, in the spirit of win-win, you wouldn't want to turn back all the barrels you ordered with toasted head and leave your cooper hanging on them for a year in a warehouse. Of course, you can hold some of your barrels on the highest levels to one side and not fill them yet. You could possibly switch out barrels with other wines that are still in élevage from other vintages. There's a lot of tools that you can use, but definitely you're going to stay away from the higher toast levels. And if you can, after fermentation, go into neutral oak or into stainless steel, you definitely want to go through malolactic, ideally in stainless steel, and you're going to want to start élevage without the impact of new oak while you evaluate and get your test data back on not just the 2 that you can test for now as far as the VP markers. You'll be wanting to use the entire sensory scale of all 7 that are available once lab capacity opens back up. And of course, the best tool, the nose knows and the palate doesn't lie. So we'll be watching these wines as they move in the cellar. I personally have done this in vintage 17. When the fires broke out really late, there was maybe 5% of the crop still hanging up on some of the mountain vineyards. And we watched a mountain vineyard lot for over a year before we moved it into its target barrels and then polished it off, added a few extra months of élevage to let the barrels integrate, and the wine is fantastic. But again, it takes more work, a little bit more cost, a little more space, and then with COVID, a little bit more distance. And we all have to just give ourselves the grace to move very slowly and very methodically. And on a positive note, COVID and this electronic working virtual world that has exploded since spring, has become an amazing tool for also overcoming these real-time challenges with adding lots of extra work at harvest to mitigate smoke. So I will say it's a silver lining. We're all much better. We have better tools. We have better communication. And we also are, we love this industry. Whether you're a winemaker, a grower, or a wine lover, none of us want this vintage to fail. So we're just going to have to hold ourselves to our usual quality standards, work 10 times as hard, be vigilant, be patient. And at the end of the day, we will come out ahead. But it is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride as we go through the hard times, and wrap up this vintage.
What I love about this industry is how everybody's sharing information. I know at the one of the meetings with Women for the Wine Sense, you were just speaking with Australian winemakers who actually went through the COVID harvest already, and you were learning and gaining the know-how for how to handle the vintage from the winemakers that actually went through that same experience. So those Zoom calls are really allowing us to connect, to share the information, and to be better prepared. Well, Julie, thank you so much for our conversation. You gave us such a wealth of insights to the 2020 vintage and altogether to understanding the smoke tank, understanding the challenges that the winemakers and grape growers are going through, especially in the luxury tier of wine production here in Napa and Sonoma. And with that, we're going to take our listeners to understand that this vintage is going to be a fantastic vintage. It's going to be a vintage that will bring in a lot of care, a lot of hard work. So once you have that bottle of 2020, please do think about the hard work that the people in the industry here put into making the great 2020 wines out of one of the hardest vintages and biggest challenges. Thank you for being a guest of Napa Valley Wine Academy.
Thank you, and happy harvest. We will overcome.
Happy harvest.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much to Monica and Julie for this fascinating topic today, something that is really important to understand, especially in the times that we're facing currently. So a really nice in-depth look at what is going on in the industry right now. Join us back here on Monday for our Monday Fun Day Trivia, which will be Monday at 2 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And we'll be back again with another study hall on the following Wednesday. In the meantime, take care, drink well, and be kind. Cheers.